Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from one of the world's most prestigious but quite young libraries, and we sit on the lands of one of the great ancient libraries of Australia, a rich repository of oral tradition. I am on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here with us this morning. Welcome. It is an absolute delight to have your company. Here we are back again, 2025. I had to write it down on a piece of paper yesterday. It still seems a little bit all fresh and new, which is excellent. And also fresh and new is this presentation a little bit. So you would have known us last year as Scholars Talks, but to emphasise that these presentations, which have these extraordinary stories from the library's collections, all presented by the library's fellows, we have renamed these sessions Fellows Findings. So thank you very much for finding that and coming along and registering this morning. We are using some slightly different technology today, so you'll still be able to ask questions the way you always have. There's a little Q&A feature. You can type those questions that you might want to ask of today's presenter in that box, and I will be back in a little while to ask those questions for you. Now, it is February and Valentine's Day is almost upon us. I'm not known for being terribly romantic, but we thought, why not? Let's do something very romantic for this February Fellows Findings. So it is a great privilege to have Robin Walsh with us today. He's a librarian of exceptional standing, admired by all of his peers, but he is probably better known as a leading authority on Lachlan Macquarie. And today he's going to share with us this story of love, loss and yearning, which is quite, I think, an undertold story of Macquarie. So I'm going to hand over to Robin now, and I'll see you all in a little while for some Q&A. Thanks so much, Robin.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, women and romance in the life of Lachlan Macquarie is not a topic that's generally engaged the attention of historians, except in passing or as a series of generalised statements regarding his two marriages. But is it realistic to assume that prior to his first marriage to Jane Jarvis in 1793, that Macquarie had not developed any other romantic or sexual attractions in his time in North America, Britain and India? Macquarie's two marriages remain a study in contrasts. How did these two women differ in personality and temperament? What were some of the features and characteristics of Macquarie's second marriage to Elizabeth Campbell of Aids in 1807? How successfully did they accommodate the shadow of Jane into their relationship? And how did they share their lives together in Australia between 1810 and 1822, and subsequently in Britain and Europe prior to Macquarie's death in July 1824? Today I want to delve a little more deeply and perhaps forensically into this important topic. Most importantly, I want to move beyond the more common masculine narrative of events and achievements. In some ways, this will involve creating a chronicle of the human heart. I want to trace some of the key emotional moments in Macquarie's life journey. I've always been taken by this poem, which appears in Anglo-American poet T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. It says, what we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning, and the end is where we start from. So it's at the end I want to start from now. And one of the most poignant insights is a tiny slip of paper that you'll find inserted into Macquarie's 1796 letter book in the Mitchell Library. This is a comment in Elizabeth Macquarie's handwriting, written in pencil and dated the 15th of September. So she indicates that she's been forced to stop reading at this particular point in time because she's going to be departing from the Isle of Mull the following day. Now this paper slip is located in the middle of a letter addressed to Mrs. Marianne Clefane of Toulouse. And she's a distant kinswoman of Lachlan Macquarie. And she's a niece of the first wife of the last clan chief of Clan Macquarie. So they're sort of distant cousins. Elizabeth was on the point of leaving for London the following day when she planned to take up residence while Lachlan Macquarie Jr. was attending a school at Dr. Pinkney's preparatory school in East Sheen. She couldn't take her husband's dead papers and letters with her, but she was clearly trying to understand his early years in India and the circumstances of his first marriage. Most importantly, she was reading her late husband's letter book at precisely the point that marked one of the key emotional moments of his adult life, the letters relating to his first wife, Jane. Elizabeth had lived under the shadow of this event for the whole of her married life, and it had remained an unresolved issue between them. Perhaps this is best highlighted by the fact that immediately prior to his final trip to London in April 1824, Lachlan placed in her hand a number of items. And she says in a letter after his death to people here in New South Wales, on the fatal morning, he put into my hand a little box which I had never seen. I opened it. It contained trinkets, pocketbooks, and different little things of that sort, which had belonged to Mrs. Macquarie. He had always had this box in the trunk with his most particular and private papers. He said, I give you this. There are things in it which may be useful to you and Lachlan. I was so astonished and alarmed that I exclaimed, my God, you terrify me out of my senses by the way you are going on. So here we've got, a very tangible expression of Elizabeth's sense of there were private things in Macquarie's life and he had kept them private. And he waits almost as if he has a premonition that he won't be returning from London. And so he wants to share these items with her. So it's not unsurprising that she would be reading his letter book after his death. Where else would a second wife and a grieving widow go in her reading than to the point where her husband was describing his first wife and in particular the details of her death. Now Elizabeth could explore this topic without restriction. Now, one of the other treasures in the Mitchell Library that I've been examining this year or last year is this set of Macquarie miniatures. There are 8 miniatures mounted on a fabric board like this, and there are 2 small engraved shields that go with it. 6 of the miniatures are oval shaped and encased in gold framed lockets with plaited hair samples on the reverse side, and that occurs in 5 of the miniatures. The Mitchell Library corporate records indicate that they were given to the Mitchell Library in 1976 by a niece of the last Campbell Laird of Jura. 5 of the 8 portraits can be identified. However, there are 3 women who remain a mystery. So you'll see in the top centre point what almost undoubtedly is Jane Jarvis, Macquarie's first wife. And then down the bottom, there are 2 unidentified women. And they're obviously 2 female adults in white bodice empire line dresses. And on the reverse side of those 2 miniatures, there are plaited samples of their hair. So the mystery is, who are these women? What significance do they carry? And it's an ongoing mystery for me. So let's start with the chronicle of the human heart. The key to understanding Lachlan Macquarie is his uncle, Murdoch MacLean, the 19th Laird of Lochbuie. He was his maternal uncle, and it was Murdoch MacLean who paid for Lachlan Macquarie's early education near Edinburgh. And he's also the man who took Lachlan Macquarie to North America in 1776 and recruited him into the 84th Regiment of Foot, and they were based in Nova Scotia at the beginning of the American War of Independence. Excuse me. Now, the first indication of women in Macquarie's life occurs in 1783. By this stage, Macquarie had been serving in North America for almost 6 years, and he was now living in Jamaica, though he had spent about 2 to 3 years in Nova Scotia. And so we have a mention of Mary Polly Gray. And he's writing to Murdoch MacLean from Jamaica, and Murdoch is still in Nova Scotia. And he says, of all the places in Nova Scotia, Windsor would be my choice for being quartered in. Perhaps there may have been some things attracting in it when I was there that makes me now so partial to it. From your account of it, it must be a most delightful place at present to live in. So Windsor is just north of Halifax in Nova Scotia. There's no want of female society there. The little young pouts are now becoming fine, charming, grown-up women, dealing their kind looks around to the happy, numerous swains who feast their eyes with their loving charms. Such are the happy men who live at Windsor. There's a sense of regret here. My vanity is much flattered when you say that none of the belles have so powerful an effect upon your cool deliberations as Polly Gray. I'm particularly happy to find that you are not insensible to her charms. I'm convinced you are as susceptible of tender impressions as the rest of mankind, and I likewise conceive you to be a good judge of beauty. After allowing this to be the case, I pay myself a great compliment, because your taste and mine coincide, for PG, or Polly Gray, was a very great favourite of mine and is so now. And then it goes on in the letters, I thought her indeed very pretty, and I'm glad to find you approve of my taste in being of the same opinion. Though I have a very great regard for her, I shall willingly relinquish all my pretensions and claims to the prize. What extraordinary masculine claims, and be happy in having the honour of calling her aunt. If you're not disposed in this way yourself, I wish, sir, you would try how far you can succeed in recommending my suit to her serious consideration. Now, Murdoch MacLean had been widowed in 1780, so he's in a position to make a claim. Murdoch's in his late 40s, early 50s at this point in time, and nothing comes of this, but it's I guess Lachlan's letter is indicative of a young man, trying out his oats and his chances for the future. All right, now we move to India, which is a key to understanding Macquarie's early adult life, and he will be based in India between 1788 and 1807, with a brief return to Britain, which I'll come to in due course. So he was based in Bombay, and this panorama by James Wales, and Wales was in Bombay at the same time as Macquarie. Whether they ever met, it's been difficult to determine, but they certainly moved in the same social circles. So this is a view of Bombay Harbour and the fort. What we need to bear in mind is that Bombay was a series of 7 islands which were tidally connected. So you could get stranded if you missed the tide. But these are some general views looking back towards the Bombay itself. in this particular view by James Whale, it shows a party of English ladies and soldiers on the island of Elephanta, which is like a 30-minute trip from Bombay itself, and there's some very famous caves located on there. And in reading Macquarie's journals, he quite often refers to going on picnics and parties to the surrounding islands and viewing spots. Intriguingly, in 1788, he makes this comment in his journal about going to a ball, and he says, "I danced a couple of country dances with a Mrs. Capon, a country-born lady. They are sometimes called, ladies of this descriptions, blueskins, for their dark complexions being the offspring of European fathers by Moor or Gentoo women." So it's an indication of just how complicated society in Bombay could be. And in the days before the Raj really becomes established, so many British soldiers would marry either local women or they would take local women as what they call bibbies to, you know, meet their personal needs. Mrs. Capon is someone that Macquarie will have ongoing contact with. And then this particular letter that we're looking at, he talks about dancing with Miss Rose. So what I want to highlight is that there were a number of women in Bombay, what would later be called the fishing fleet, was just starting to begin at that stage, which is where young English women would go out to Bombay or Calcutta or Madras looking for husbands. And so now we come to the courtship of Macquarie with Jane Jarvis. She was born on the island of Antigua in the West Indies from a large and substantial plantation family. Her father was the Chief Justice of Antigua, and she was one of at least 18 children to the one mother. So it's quite an extraordinary family tree when you start to delve into it. There is this miniature in the Mitchell Library, which has been ascribed as being a miniature of Jane, although the evidence must still be left hanging because there's no other evidence apart from the historian Malcolm Ellis, who presented it to the Mitchell Library, saying that it was Jane. So in looking at Macquarie's journal, it's possible to create a chronology of when he first meets Jane, and that dates back to November of 1792. And then he records how he attends dinner at in the Morley household. Jane Jarvis's sister Dorothea had married a Bombay merchant called James Morley, and so there were quite often dinners and parties that took place in the upper elite of Bombay society, and Macquarie was amongst those who was able to get an invitation and to attend. But things have clearly ramped up by June of 1793, and as I've highlighted here, he talks about having the felicity of dancing 2 dances with Miss Jarvis and of handing her to supper. And these balls and dinners that they attend seem to happen with great frequency in June and July and August. And there is an account in Macquarie's journal where James Morley comes almost unannounced to Lachlan's accommodation and asks him what his intentions are with his sister-in-law. And Macquarie's account almost has him quite flabbergasted that he's been put on the spot, because he now has to declare his desires and intentions towards Jane. And the only stumbling block is at that stage his rank in the army is not sufficient to make her or to make him a suitable partner. But by August he has received a promotion that now makes him acceptable, so things can proceed. And so in September 1793, a wedding takes place in the Morley household, and in his journal he describes all the people that attended, and they tend to be all the senior merchants and military officers of Bombay at that time. What I particularly like is this description of what happens at the end of the day, because Mrs. Morley takes her sister back to Macquarie's accommodation, and Macquarie says Mrs. Morley stayed to see her bedded and then took leave of her sister. I handed Mrs. Morley to her chair and saw her off. I imagine with great eagerness, then undressed as quick as possible and flew on the wings of love to my dearest of women, to finally crown my measure of happiness and bliss. So we don't have any other details, but we can well imagine what was taking place. The Macquaries then spend the next 12 months in Bombay, but it becomes increasingly apparent that it's far too expensive for them to maintain a lifestyle there of endless parties and wining and dining. And so Macquarie takes the opportunity of joining his regiment down at Calicut. And so in December of 1793, they relocate down to the Malabar coast and set up house on the outskirts of Calicut. There's quite a substantial fortress which you can still visit today, but there's no trace of the house where Macquarie took his new bride. But interestingly, he renames this cottage in the jungle Staffa Lodge. So the Isle of Staffa belonged to Clan Macquarie, and it's just off the coast from the Isle of Mull. So the Scottish connections keep coming through all the time in Macquarie's writings. So here's a view of Calicut on the Malabar coast. And it had a long and distinguished connection with European traders dating back to Vasco da Gama. But then towards the end of, in August, July-August of 1795, Macquarie is ordered to take part in a military campaign against the Dutch at Cochin. And so this is the first time he's been separated from Jane, and she's incredibly tearful at the separation. She tries to insist that she should accompany him on the campaign, and he explains that this would be impossible. And so the British forces lay siege to Cochin. They bombard it, and Macquarie's journal explains how he was part of the artillery bombardment that takes place, and the Dutch surrender, and then Macquarie returns to Calicut. But then within 3 months, he's posted to Sri Lanka. And again, another military campaign against the Dutch, and he takes part in the siege of Colombo, and then is sent as the commanding officer down to the southwest corner of the island to Galle. So if you've been watching cricket this week, you'll know that the Australian team's been quite successful in their efforts there. And it's possible to stand on the walls of the fort at Galle and look down into the cricket ground and watch without having to to pay the entrance fee. But it's this separation that becomes quite critical in the story, because Jane doesn't remain at Calicut, but Macquarie takes her, before he leaves for Ceylon, back to Bombay, and she lives with friends there. And while he's in command at Gaul, he receives some disturbing news to say that Jane has become quite sick. And so he rushes back to Bombay from Gaul, and just a quick view of what the fortress looks like. And then we begin what I'm calling a chronology of grief. So by mid-May, he has returned to Bombay, discovered that Jane is in fact far more seriously ill than he was led to believe, and that she's actually in the latter stages of tuberculosis. So the doctors recommend that a long sea voyage is probably the only possibility of improving her health. And so he finds what we call a country ship, the name of the Exeter, to sail to China. And so they stop at Malacca on the way to China, and then they arrive in Macau on the 2nd of July. During the voyage, Jane's health seems to improve with the fresh air and escape the humidity of Bombay. Unfortunately, within 2 weeks, her condition just deteriorates quite significantly, and she dies on the 15th of July at Macau. And Macquarie's journal has not survived from that time, apart from recording the details of her death. But it's quite apparent that he is almost driven to the edge of insanity. His grief is so profound. Some of his writings talk about how he had to be dragged away from her body, and he had to virtually go into solitary confinement. So profound was his grief. And so some of the local officials, English merchants, encourage him to go up the Pearl River to Canton. And so after 6 weeks grieving in Macau, he travels up the river and spends the next 2 months approximately on board ship and visiting the factories, which were the merchant houses in Canton, which is now known as Guangzhou. So there you have the indication of the chronology. The morning at Macau, the residence at Whampoa near Canton, and then in early November he returns to Macau to collect her coffin and his servants. Now the coffin is a really intriguing marker of Macquarie's grief. He had approached the Portuguese officials who controlled Macau and was told that no, she couldn't be buried there, and the Chinese wouldn't permit him to bury her on the Chinese mainland. And so he made arrangements for a special coffin to be created to preserve her body in. He decided he would take her back to Bombay. And I've spent years and years trying to work out the nature of this coffin and how her body was preserved. More recently, I've come to the conclusion that she wasn't preserved in a barrel of alcohol or something like that, but in actual fact, it was a large square coffin, probably encased in mud, to reduce the possibilities of any bacteria. And so he has left that coffin at Macau, and when he returns in early November, he then has to work out how he's going to get the coffin on board the ship that he's arranged to go back to Bombay on. So there's in his letters, and there are approximately 50 letters that Macquarie writes in the period at Macau and near Canton, where he describes his experiences and then the arrangements that he has to undergo to get her coffin on board the ship. And it has to be rowed out in a sampan to meet the ship that's going to India as it comes down the Pearl River. So there's a lot of anxiety and worry associated with getting her body and the rendezvous with the country ship Sarah. By mid-January, he's back in Bombay with the coffin, and he goes very silent in the succeeding couple of years. He volunteers for a number of military campaigns, and he indicates that he doesn't care whether he lives or whether he dies. He doesn't see that there's any reason for living. And so there's a military campaign back down on the Malabar coast, and then in 1799 he's part of the British campaign against Tipu Sultan, who was the Raja of Mysore, and the capital of Srirangapatna is laid under siege, and the citadel is stormed, and thousands of people are killed, and the soldiers loot as much as possible throughout the city. Macquarie acquires, as part of his prize money, a collection of gemstones, which he will later sell on the China market. And then towards the end of 1799, he records the fact that he's removed the black crepe armband that he's been wearing for the last 4 years and 2 months. He'd also arranged for a black marble tombstone to be prepared in Britain and shipped out to Bombay. Now, intriguingly, and I mean the actual tomb inscription is about 460 words in length. It's absolutely enormous. The first grave slab is broken in transit, and so he has to order another one from Britain. And in 1999, I went to Bombay looking for Jane's tomb and discovered that the cemetery no longer exists. The whole area was bulldozed flat in the 1950s and was turned into a public park. And only some of the gravestone inscriptions were preserved, and Jane's were not amongst them. But we have here a mid-19th century photograph that shows the European cemetery at Bombay, and it would have been, Jane's coffin would have been one of those tabletop tombs you see in the foreground there, and whether that black marble slab that we see in the foreground was hers, we will never know. So we go back to Jane's sister, Dorothea Morley, because clearly Macquarie felt a strong connection with his sister-in-law. And so amongst those 50 letters that he wrote from Macau is this extraordinary 48-page letter where he gives her all of the details of Jane's death and the arrangements that he's going to make for her burial in Bombay. And then there are more letters that follow in the period up to 1803. In the meantime, Dorothea Morley has become a widow. James Morley died in 1798 and had a quite toxic relationship between the two men. James Morley always thought that Lachlan was a gold digger and was only after Jane's fortune because she had an inheritance of £6,000, and it's that £6,000 that really sets Macquarie up for life, allows him to subsequently acquire land in Scotland. So on the homecoming, what's notable in Macquarie's journal is that he spends a lot of time in London at the home of Dorothea Morley and her sisters. He accompanies them to Scotland in 1804, so he hires a carriage, and he and Dorothea and her sister Christiana travel with him. Macquarie goes to the Isle of Mull, which is where Murdoch McLean lived and is in the final stages of his life. And so Macquarie rushes to Mull, and it's while he's at Lochbuie House, which is down on the southern shores of the Isle of Mull in this map. That's the house. He meets Elizabeth Campbell of Aids. Now, the intriguing thing about all of this is that Elizabeth's older sister, Jane, is married to Murdoch McLean. So this is more in the line of a traditional clan relationship. Jane and Murdoch had 10 children, and Elizabeth was there assisting with the young children. So she was in her mid-20s at this stage, had not seemingly had any marriage proposals in that period. So approaching spinsterhood seems to be her fate. But it's while they are there at the house and Murdoch dies that Macquarie meets Elizabeth for the first time, and what seems to be a sparky relationship starts to develop. Although, and I'll just show you these quick pictures of Aird's house where Elizabeth was born. And that's the view from the house looking down over Loch Linen, and the Isle of Mull is just across the way from there. And then at the very top of the house is this emblem for the Campbells of Aids, and their inscription is "Be mindful." So that's so in an era where we seem to be obsessed with mindfulness, looks like the Campbells of Aids had stolen a march on that long ago. Now, over the next 5 months approximately, Macquarie is back in London. He's fallen under a cloud with the War Office for some dodgy dealings involving his nephews. And he's going to be sent back to India as his punishment. So he won't be cashiered, although potentially he should have been. But in March of 1805, he says in his journal, after very mature and deliberate consideration and reflection on so important a step, I took an opportunity this forenoon of waiting on Miss Elizabeth Campbell at the house of her aunt, and finding her alone, I made a full avowal to her of my sentiments and of my sincere love and affection for her, explaining fully to her at the same time, previous to her giving me any answer to this declaration of my sentiments, the utter impossibility of our immediate union, nor until after my return from India, which I promised should not be delayed beyond 4 years. So it's quite a big ask to propose and then say, but you can't come with me, and it may be as long as 4 years before I'm going to be back. Surprisingly, and again, there's a reference to Jane in all of this, and the vow that he claims he made on the 31st of July back then, that he would never bring another wife to India. Her response, according to him, was to say with the kindest and most good-natured attention, and to my infinite joy and delight, and a few other things, that, she accepted. We discoursed a long time on this very interesting and delicate subject, and then took leave for the present, agreeing to meet as soon as possible after until my departure for India. Now, I think you've got to bear in mind that Macquarie's journals were written with a view that he knew other people would be reading it. They're not confessional documents. So it's a PR exercise in many respects. And this would have been written while he was sailing back to India. But when you go and look at what he was doing in London in the period prior to proposing to Elizabeth and after the meeting, his social calendar doesn't include her very much in the following month. So he sails in late April, but all he seems to record in his journal is who he had dinner with, who he visited out in the countryside, and things that didn't seem to include Elizabeth very much. This portrait of Macquarie, which is also held in the Mitchell Library by the noted artist John Opie, is also a key, I think, to understanding Macquarie's state of mind. In this extract from his journal, he explains about how much he paid for having the portrait painted, and that it was originally intended for his dear mother, who was still alive on the Isle of Mull. And he says, in the meantime, my sister Mrs. Morley, having expressed a particular desire to keep it, I could not refuse her so slight a favour where so kindly intended. So it begs the question, why wasn't it left with Elizabeth if she was going to be his future bride? So it's an intriguing sort of psychological paradigm. Again, in his journal, he indicates he spent his last day in town with his beloved and dearest Elizabeth. And then there's a farewell dinner, which he was the only male being of the party. And then he describes their distress at parting. And I left her in the care of her friends, the two Miss Stewarts. And we'll come back to the Miss Stewarts a little bit later. Macquarie is away in India for 2 years, and no copy of the letters that were exchanged between Lachlan and Elizabeth have survived. I suspect that Elizabeth destroyed them all, and that may not be all that uncommon. After the death of a partner, quite often in those times, those things that were regarded of particularly personal nature were not regarded as meriting, preservation. It was just too personal. So I'm not reading too much into that, but it's clear in Macquarie's journals that Elizabeth became increasingly frustrated with him out in India, and when she realised that his regiment had been sent back to Britain, but he was still living in Bombay as the military secretary to the governor of Bombay, and all the perks that go with living at Government House, I think her frustration becomes even greater. And for a period there, she actually stops writing to him. Now, when you consider it takes 3 months for a letter to go either overland or by sea, this is really turning the emotional screws. And so it effectively forces him to curtail the original 4 years into 2 years. And by November of 1807, he's back in Britain, and they're married in November of that year. And then he joins his regiment in Scotland in early 1808. And it's during that time that Elizabeth falls pregnant for the first time, and a daughter, Jane Jarvis Macquarie, is born, and she dies 3 months later in December of 1808. And it's in that context that the Macquaries discover that he's been sent to New South Wales. As the commanding officer of the 73rd Regiment, it's his responsibility to go. But then when the man who had been nominated as the governor of New South Wales, another military officer, General Nightingale, suddenly decided that he had contracted gout and wouldn't be able to go, Macquarie put his hand up to come. So the heart of this story now becomes producing an heir. And in In the period just before the Macquarie sale for New South Wales, Elizabeth suffers a miscarriage and is quite sick. And when she boards ship, she's quite ill from the consequences. In New South Wales, there seem to have been at least 6 further miscarriages that take place until Lachlan Jr. is born in 1814. So clearly there, is a strong emotional commitment between the two of them, and it focuses on Lachlan Jr. And that's the miniature that we're looking at the beginning of the presentation. I'm not going to delve into the Macquaries in New South Wales. There are, more than enough scholars and people who have talked about that aspect. But it's the return to Scotland that I particularly want to look at and to show you what they were returning to. Macquarie possessed 20,000 acres on the Isle of Mull, 10,000 acres that had been purchased from his uncle, Murdoch McLean, and another 10,000 that had been purchased from the Duke of Argyll while he was away in New South Wales. And this was the house that the Macquaries returned to, Grulin House. And you'll see on the right-hand side that there is an extension to the house. And when Macquarie returned to London in 1824 to seek a pension from the government, Elizabeth added that wing to the house. It was going to be her homecoming surprise for him. And he died in London in July of 1824, so he never got to see it. And his coffin was brought back to Mull and laid out, most likely either in the downstairs room of the extension or in the parlour room, which is on the left-hand side of the entrance door there. So, Macquarie's premonition, which we talked about before, Elizabeth, in that same letter we quoted earlier, says, finally, when he took leave of me, he burst into tears, which he never did before on any occasion regarding me that I am aware of. The recollection of this is one of the most agreeable I have to reflect on, being to me a convincing proof, had such been required, of his affection. So here we come to the question of yearning. Macquarie yearned for Jane Jarvis all her life. Elizabeth yearned for Macquarie's affirmation and affection. There are so many levels of meaning that we can read into the love and the loss and the yearning when we look at Macquarie's emotional life throughout all of his experiences in different parts of the world. Macquarie is buried within this stone circle on the Isle of Mull. The burial ground is only about 300 metres from the main house. The mausoleum itself dates from the early 1850s and was probably commissioned by Lachlan Macquarie Jr.'s widow. So people who didn't know the full story, but you'll see that this is the famous tomb inscription that Elizabeth commissioned in about 1832 and would have been placed on the ground above where Macquarie was buried. And subsequently it would have been raised up and incorporated into this side of the mausoleum. And it's right down the bottom that the phrase, the Father of Australia, is first used. And so we live with the consequences of that affirmation that comes from Elizabeth. So lastly, we come back to the miniatures again. The two women at the bottom continue to intrigue me. I have a list of a dozen women who they could possibly be. So they may be the Mrs. Stewart of Albemarle Street, and we know that they looked after Elizabeth while Macquarie was away. The Macquaries visited the two women in Rome during a European trip they made in 1823. The question of the dress that the women are wearing are possibly a key to understanding who they are. But who's to say that Dorothea Morley and other members of the Jarvis family may be included there? The actual mounting of the objects on the board seems to date from the latter 19th century, but still can't be ascertained with, in any definite sort of way. So I guess that's my challenge at the moment, to see if I can tease out more information about those miniatures and the connections that go with it. So there are the hair samples of the two women at the back. I guess if we had a lot of money and a lot of DNA testing took place, it could be a possibility, but I don't think the State Library has that sort of money, but maybe sometime in the future researchers will do that. So we go back to T.S. Eliot. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning, and the end is where we start from. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Robin. That was absolutely terrific. I was pointed out to me that I did not introduce myself. I know I've done that a couple of times over the years. I get so excited about introducing one of my fellows and all the fabulous things that they've been doing, because I've been working so closely with them here in the fellows room and in the Mitchell reading room, that I forget to tell you I am Rachel Franks, and it is my job to look after the fellows. I think I've said this a few times already this year. I do have the best job in the library, but don't tell Richard Neville I've been saying that on live television. So let's turn to a few questions. A few of you are showing your appreciation. I can see lots of little hands applauding in this, the new technology that we've been using for these presentations this morning. I would like to start by saying that not all of it, Robin, was as romantic as I had been anticipating. Meeting personal needs sounds all rather medical and almost unpleasant, but certainly susceptible charms. And I don't think anybody can deny certainly the love between Lachlan and Jane. So, of course, the most obvious question is, and you did sort of touch on this at the end, but a couple of people are asking, how did Elizabeth feel? Was she constantly in this shadow of the first wife? Do you think there was a third person at dinner always?
Not always, but I think the shadow of Jane is inescapable in so much of what we read, and particularly that letter that she writes to the Reverend William Cowper in 1825, describing Macquarie's death and what she had been doing and how she was dealing with her grief. And those those two quotations just seem to be indicative of, a neediness, a desire for affirmation. And the fact that the contrast between the first marriage being clearly a love match and the second one being a clan-based marriage, it was more a partnership and a highly successful one. And it's clear that they were the power couple here in New South Wales. I mean, that's a phrase that Grace Karskens has coined, and I don't disagree with it at all. And I think so many of the achievements that are attributed to Lachlan should go to Elizabeth. She's the power behind the throne. So it's not that she wasn't given power and agency, but at an emotional level, I think there's still a yearning on her part for Lachlan to confirm that she's loved she's clearly appreciated and valued, but there's still a neediness there.
It's not quite the same, is it?
No, it's not the same.
A few people are asking, and this is actually a really good question, and I'm glad that it's coming through. So you've spent a lot of your life with Macquarie. I won't declare how many years you've been researching this man. A lot of people here today are very familiar with the story of Macquarie, or at least the main threads of the story, but they are quite new to this. Some people are even saying, oh, I forgot altogether that he had a first wife before Elizabeth. So just in the archive that you've been looking at, and I know you've been looking at lots of material here at the Mitchell Library, but also at sources in other repositories, this romantic life of Macquarie, what sort of percentage do you think that makes up of all of the archival material that he's left behind? Do you see it as someone close to him that's actually quite a dominant or at least prominent story? Or did you, as a scholar of him, actually have to look quite hard for these details?
It's not a question of looking hard, but it's a question of looking differently. What some scholars talk about working against the grain. So rather than just reading Macquarie's journals and letters as accounts of what he's been doing and what he's achieved and what he hopes to achieve, we need to go back and almost flip the coin and read between the lines and to see, well, who were the women that are mentioned in his letters? So I've spent the last few years transcribing all of Macquarie's personal letters. So I'm up to about 700 letters at the moment. And the bulk of those are in the Mitchell Library, in his letter books, but they're only the copies. There are original letters held in some British institutions, and they, amplify that question of the women in his story. So it's only by collating those letters and then doing the footnotes and thinking, well, he talks about going to dinner with such and such, or I danced to dance with Miss Rose or Mrs. Rose or Mrs. Capon. And it's then that you start to think, well, let's reread this, putting the women at the front. So in terms of percentages, no, I haven't done a calculation at this stage, but I'd say probably at least 20% of his writings include women to some extent. And so, we need to rethink the Macquarie story and how we interpret it and realign things. So I'm always amazed that so much of his material has survived. We're in a unique position for someone who in his own generation didn't rate very highly. He wasn't a major player. So many of the people that he mentions in his letters and his journals went on to have stellar careers as military officers or as politicians. His highest achievement obviously is to be Governor of New South Wales, but his contemporaries would have said, well, he was the governor of a penal settlement. So, we're very fortunate that his letter books have survived, along with some those caches of other letters in other parts of the world. So, yes, I'm reading with different eyes, not interested particularly in what he did, but more in who he met and what significance they had to his life.
Well, another interpretation. I love this about our library and the fellows that come in, how they, can go into what we assume is quite well-trod material and find something new and something insightful and something more relevant, and often that better humanises some of these figures from what is a really fraught past. So that is actually all we have time for today. I'll leave you with the women of Macquarie and everybody wondering about all of the other things, including delightful dances. Do join us next time. Dr. Caitlin de Gluis, one of our Hertzberg Fellows, will be talking about her research on the 4th of March at 11 here online at the library. And she's been mapping labour in the convict settlement of Parramatta. So again, something we think we all know and understand quite well, but a really interesting new way, a new lens to look at how people were operating in Parramatta in the early days of New South Wales. And if you don't like meeting our fellows through a small screen, you can meet some of them in real life. We are starting a brand new series called Fellows Forum, where we will have a panel of fellows talking about a theme or a topic or exploring a particular type of fellowship. So the first of these will be at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, the 26th of February. It will be on site only in the library's Dixon room, and we will be celebrating some of our summer fellows. Philip Bartlett will be there, Eloise Reddy will be there, Bronwyn Renix will also be there in conversation with our Mitchell librarian, Richard Neville, and he'll be talking about some of their discoveries in the library's collections and asking them about their time here as a fellow. I hope to see you in real life or online soon. Until then, thank you very much for coming. Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.